The night was the kind that wrapped around a man's throat and made him listen to his own heartbeat. A suffocating darkness stretched across the wild west prairie, broken only by the silver gleam of the moon crawling its way through the clouds. And Elijah Cole, a rancher who had spent more nights under the stars than inside four walls, rode his horse slow and careful through the gulch, the sound of hooves muffled by the dust as though even the earth was holding its breath, because he knew something was wrong. Felt it in his bones, the way coyotes had gone quiet, the way the wind carried nothing but the stench of fear. And then, just as he rounded the bend near the dry riverbed, his lantern caught at a post standing jagged against the night, a crude timber driven into the ground like a marker, and tied to it, slumped and trembling, was a woman, her arms bound high, wrists raw from the rope, her head bent low beneath matted strands of hair. And Elijah froze, instinct screaming at him, because men didn't tie women to posts, unless they wanted a vol for a buzzard to finish the job, or unless they were waiting for someone dumb enough, someone with too much decency left in him, to ride in and play the hero. And Elijah had played the hero once before, years ago, when it cost him his brother's life in a border skirmish, and he had sworn never to let compassion blind him again. But the moment he saw her shoulders quake, the way she seemed to fight just to stay upright, that oath crumbled, because he wasn't made of stone, no matter how much he wished he was. So he slid off his horse, hand hovering near the colt on his hip, every muscle strung tight as a bowstring, his boots crunching against the gravel as he stepped closer. And when his shadow fell across her, she stirred, her lips parting just enough for a whisper, hoarse and weak, to slip through. "I'm just bait." And those words froze him harder than the sight of her. Because bait meant trap, bait meant teeth in the dark, bait meant somebody was watching, laughing maybe, waiting for him to step closer. And Elijah's eyes shot to the ridges, the rocks, the scrub along the gulch, searching for the glint of steel or the flick of movement. But the night was still, so still it was unbearable, and he crouched down, his knife flashing in the lantern glow as he pressed it to the rope, hesitating just long enough to ask himself if this was worth dying for. If she was worth the lead storm waiting in the shadows. But then he thought of his sister, the one he couldn't save, the one whose screams still tore through his dreams. And the decision was made, the blade slicing clean, the rope snapping like gunfire in the silence. And the woman collapsed forward into his arms, frail and fever-hot, her body trembling like she'd been left there for days, her breath shallow and rapid. And Elijah held her steady, whispering low, "You're all right, I got you." Even though his gut told him nothing was all right, not with the hairs on the back of his neck rising, not with the silence pressing in too heavy. And as he lifted her onto his horse, his lantern swayed, and for the briefest instant he saw them eyes, too many eyes, reflecting from the ridge, glimmering cold and hungry, not animals, but men, half a dozen at least, maybe more, rifles glinting in the moonlight, waiting, watching. And his blood went ice. Because this was no rescue, this was a stage, and he was standing right where they wanted him, with the bait in his arms and nowhere to run. And yet he mounted, heart pounding, the woman sagging against his chest as he gathered the reins, spurring the horse forward with a grunt. And just as the animal lunged into motion, a whistle cut through the night, sharp and shrill, followed by the crack of a rifle, the bullet screaming past his ear and splintering the post where she had been bound. And suddenly the night exploded, gunfire echoing off the gulch walls, sparks flying as lead struck rock, the thunder of hooves, rising from both sides as shadows, detached themselves from the ridges and gave chase, voices shouting, laughter twisting through the chaos. And Elijah leaned low over the woman, his free hand drawing his Colt, firing blind into the dark as he pushed his horse harder, faster, every muscle straining to outrun death itself. But the riders were gaining. 6, maybe 8, their silhouettes flashing with muzzle fire, their curses rolling across the night. And Elijah's jaw clenched as rage burned through the fear, because this wasn't just an ambush, it was cruelty. It was the kind of evil that tied a woman to a post and used her as bait. And he swore to himself that he would rather die fighting than hand her back to the devils, who had left her trembling in the dirt. And the woman stirred weakly against him, her voice cracking through the gunfire. "Don't let them take me back." And the terror in her tone carved deeper into him than any bullet could. Because it wasn't just a plea, It was a confession. It was a soul begging not for life but for freedom from something worse. And Elijah knew then that whatever nightmare she had come from, he was in it now, tangled in its teeth, and there was no turning back, no cutting her loose, because the moment he freed her from that rope, he had chained himself to her fate. And as the gunfire raged and the desert swallowed their flight, Elijah felt the truth of it. He wasn't the hunter here. He wasn't the rescuer. He was the one who had walked willingly into the jaws, and the horror waiting in the dark wasn't just the men chasing him, but whatever secret this woman carried that made her whisper those 3 words, "I'm just bait," because bait was never meant to escape. And yet here they were, running, bleeding, fighting, and somewhere deep inside Elijah knew that this night was only beginning, and the real terror had yet to show its face. The desert did not sleep that night, not with thunder in the distance and men screaming behind like wolves on a blood trail. And Elijah Cole's horse tore across the gulch floor with every ounce of muscle straining, its breath hot clouds in the cold night air, while the woman slumped against him, burning with fever and mumbling words he couldn't piece together, words that sounded like prayers one moment and warnings the next. And all the while the gunfire snapped around them, ricochets sparking off stone, riders closing in with whoops and curses, until Elijah veered hard toward the old ravine that split the mesa, a cut in the earth most avoided because the ground crumbled easy and shadows hid snakes. But Elijah figured the danger of rock and serpent was kinder than the danger that howled behind. So he urged the horse down the slope, loose shale clattering under hooves, shots whizzing past as men followed, reckless enough to risk the fall just to taste blood. And Elijah gritted his teeth, firing back once, twice, seeing a rider tumble. But more came, relentless, as if nothing short of death would pull them off this hunt. And the woman stirred, clutching weakly at his shirt, her eyes fluttering open for a heartbeat, glowing with a strange terror that cut deeper than the fear of bullets. And she rasped, "They won't stop, not till," before she trailed off, her head dropping again. And Elijah's stomach sank, because he already knew she was right. He had seen the way those men's eyes glowed with a madness beyond greed, a devotion like hounds bound to a master's cruel hand. And he knew this wasn't about money, not about ransom. This was something darker. And he cursed it under his breath, knowing he had dragged himself into a pit where men like him didn't crawl back out. But he wasn't about to surrender her, not after what she'd suffered. So he pressed on, his mind flashing to the stories he'd heard whispered in saloons, tales of a gang that called themselves the Hollow Creed, men who worshipped nothing but the hunt, men who believed sacrifice fed the desert itself, and how they marked their victims as bait, leaving them tied for the curious, the noble, the foolish to stumble on, so that in saving one soul they doomed themselves to join the ritual. And Elijah's hands tightened on the reins because he feared, now that those whispers were more than ghost tales, feared that this trembling woman was one of their offerings, and he had cut the rope like a lamb wandering into the slaughter pen. But there was no undoing it now. No turning her back like to them, drum of war, so he drove his horse harder. The ravine narrowed, walls closing high, shadows wrapping around them like a coffin. And in that suffocating dark he heard it, no gunfire now, no laughter, just the echo of riders halting above, the silence stretching long and thin. And then a voice rolled down from the rim, deep and steady, dripping with the cruelty of a man who had learned patience. "Run as far as you like, rancher. She was never yours to take." And Elijah's blood turned to ice, because the words weren't shouted in anger, but spoken like a sermon, calm and certain, as if the speaker already knew how it would end. And Elijah didn't waste breath to answer, just spurred deeper into the canyon, where the walls tightened so close his horse's flanks brushed stone, the air growing damp and cool, until finally he reached a shallow cave, half hidden by thorn brush, and he pulled inside, dismounting quick, his heart racing, his ears straining for pursuit. But only the night answered, no hoofbeats, no voices, just the hollow hush of wind through stone. And there, by the faint glow of his lantern, he laid the woman down, tearing off his coat to wrap her shivering frame, his eyes taking in the bruises that painted her skin, the welts across her wrists and ankles, the scars that weren't from fresh cruelty, but from long, repeated suffering. And his fists clenched, because no soul deserved such torment. And yet she had endured, clinging somehow to breath and spirit, though her lips were cracked, her body weak. And when she stirred again, whispering hoarsely, "You shouldn't have. Cut me down, they'll make you pay." Elijah leaned close, his voice low but steady. "Then let them come. I've buried men meaner than them before." Though in truth he felt the lie sting his tongue, because he had never seen men whose eyes glowed with something less than human, whose hunger seemed more ritual than rage, and he feared he had underestimated the darkness he'd pulled into his life. But he swallowed that fear, choosing instead to draw water from his canteen, trickling it to her lips, watching her drink weakly. And as her breath steadied, her eyes opened fully for the first time, wide and glistening in the lantern glow, filled not with relief but with sorrow, as if she already knew what doom awaited him for daring to save her. And Elijah, though hardened by years of loss, felt something inside him stir, a vow unspoken, that whatever curse she carried, whatever past she bore, he would not let her face it alone, and he would not be counted among cowards. Not now, not ever. And so as the night stretched on, the riders circling like vultures above, Elijah sat with one hand on his colt and the other steadying the trembling woman, knowing dawn would bring another storm, one fiercer than gunfire. And deep inside, though he could not name it, he feared that the horror she whispered meant something more than he dared imagine, something he had only glimpsed when he looked into her haunted eyes. And perhaps that was why, when she drifted into uneasy sleep, mumbling words of sacrifice, of blood and desert gods, Elijah whispered to himself, "They picked the wrong man to snare." Though his heart hammered with doubt, and as the cold of the cave pressed in, he knew only this: the fight had barely begun, and the next chapter would demand every ounce of strength he had left. And friends, if this story grips you the way it gripped Elijah's soul, if you feel that pull of dust, blood, and fire, then don't just walk away into the night. Hit that subscribe button right now, because here in this campfire of Wild West tales, every story burns brighter with you riding alongside. And trust me, the road ahead in this tale is darker, wilder, and more shocking than anything yet. So saddle up, stay with me, and let's ride together into the next storm.